Welcome, everyone, to our first of two discussions about Plato. Today's talk goes with the readings on the Blackboard page called Plato 1 and Plato 1 Continued. They're both fairly short and sweet reads, so I hope you had an opportunity to look at them before this talk. And today, we're going to spend a good amount of time going over the contents of those readings, but I'm also going to spend a good amount of time setting the stage, so to speak, and talking about Plato and his teacher Socrates themselves at some length. So there are a lot of reasons to start an introduction to philosophy class with Plato. For one, there's the historic reason, which I think is summarized by a quote I mentioned in passing during our welcome session. Comes from a writer named Alfred North Whitehead, who stated, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." There's different ways of interpreting that, but I think one of them is Plato, in his 24 volumes of writing, produced in what's often called Golden Age Athens in ancient Greece, seems to have covered so much ground and so many different areas of philosophy, political philosophy, ethics, ontology, a word that we're going to be introduced to later on in class today, philosophy of science, epistemology, the branch of philosophy that deals with the limits of human knowledge. Plato's writings contain such a rich treatment of issues, questions, and answers within all those different branches of philosophy. And he was such a big influence on really many subsequent writers in the Western philosophical tradition that it's as though the people who came after him were just writing footnotes, in Alfred North Whitehead's terms, to Plato's own writing. So that would be one historic reason. Another reason is to start introduction to philosophy class with readings from Plato is that it's basically the star character you could think of within Plato's writings. As I started to mention last class, Plato's writings do not take the form that many subsequent philosophers deploy, which is to say a kind of treatise or an essay that presents an argument, details reasons to support it, maybe goes off and tries to destroy counter arguments, and then leaves you with a conclusion that the author wants you to agree with. Plato takes a totally different approach. It's a literary approach. His writings take dialogue form, in which instead of presenting one specific argument and then debating for it, we get to listen in, so to speak, on characters, some of whom were real life people from Plato's own time, discuss, have conversation, have dialogue with one another, usually over one or two key topics per dialogue. The star character, as I was starting to say, in all of these, just about all of these writings of Plato, is none other than Socrates. So one thing I say now, and it'll come up again and again, is that even though we're reading the writings of Plato, the all-pervasive philosophical force in his works is Plato's teacher, Socrates. Socrates was older than Plato, was a tremendous influence on Plato's life. Socrates did not do any writing of his own. It's rather Plato who gives Socrates' teachings, presents them to us in written form. And then we'll see two classes from now that kind of tradition of teacher and student was continued. After Socrates was the teacher of Plato, Plato would become the teacher of another major figure in the philosophical tradition, who is Aristotle. So the second reason to start an intro philosophy class with some writings by Plato is to introduce the figure of Socrates, who's just a incredible influence on the way philosophy would be practiced in the centuries to come, and even up to present day, arguably. And I'll just hopefully have a few moments to discuss how and why that is. Is just an enormous, kind of larger than life figure who seems to embody what it means to practice philosophy. And a third reason I will put out is just the sheer intellectual stimulation and indeed enjoyment you can get from reading Plato. Just due to the nature of the class, we're doing very small snippets out of a very large and rich body of work by Plato. But I would contend that even with those selections, you can get a lot out of them. I think the sort of first goal is to just understand what it is that these texts contain, and then start to form our own opinions and responses to them. I mean, we definitely know more with Plato than with anyone else on the list, on the list of readings for the syllabus. We definitely are not obligated to agree with Plato or anyone else we read whatsoever. I would say the goal for us should be to understand what it is that was written and really use that as a kind of springboard to start doing philosophical thinking on our own. So with all of that said, one thing I'm going to try to do throughout this semester is, kind of go over takeaways that I hope we get from a day's class. So my hope for today is that the takeaways from this discussion and from our first two readings from Plato are, one, an introduction to this figure of Socrates as Plato presents him in the dialogues. Two is an introduction to what is often called the theory of the forms, according to Plato. That's covered in the very first reading, a selection from the dialogue called the Phaedo. That theory is often said to be the example of Plato's ontology, the philosophical study of what really exists. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that word means. And my third takeaway I hope we get today is some understanding, the beginning of some understanding about the other text that's on the syllabus for today, which is known as the myth of the cave, a very rich and powerful allegory for education, for the acquisition of knowledge, also maybe has political ramifications. We can discuss all of that. So yeah, those would be the three takeaways. Who was Socrates? What is the theory of forms? And what to make of the myth of the cave? Before getting to Socrates, I'm going to go ahead and start to share my screen. I do want to set the stage a bit for his life and his work. So if you bear with me one moment, I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. I have a couple of slides for today. So as I mentioned, Plato lived during a time known as Golden Age Athens. This is not a history class. You're by no means required or expected to kind of memorize the dates on this slide, but I want to include them to just kind of orient us in space and time as to where Socrates lived and where Plato learned from him. Golden Age Athens. We're going to be talking 5th, 4th century BC, or before the Common Era. Is just a period in history that has long captivated thinkers from all different branches. It's viewed as a time of incredible cultural flourishing. I'm sure most, if not all of you, had some exposure to some of the great authors of ancient Greece, maybe during high school, maybe more recently. And a lot has been written about why at this particular relatively small place, in a span of what really comes down to just a few decades, there was an incredible cultural flourishing in which things like tragedy really took off and became fields of art that would be practiced for centuries after up to today. Why philosophy seems to have really taken off at this particular time and place. All other kinds of endeavors in literature. This is sometimes said to be the place and period when the serious practice of history with an author named Thucydides started. A lot has been written about why all of this happened in this relatively limited time and place. I don't have the answer to that question, but one factor that's often taken into account of what made Golden Age Athens so special is that its flourishing really began after a moment of crisis and a moment of triumph for Athens and other Greek city-states. This is before Greece existed as a country, and the territory was divided into more or less self-governing small city-states. Very long story, but in brief, the Athenians around 490 BC attain a key victory from an invasion by forces from Persia. And in the aftermath of this is when all those cultural endeavors that I was mentioning really seem to take off and soar. Drama, literature, history, mathematics, definitely not confined to Athens, but flourishes there as well. Astronomy, same thing. And it's around this time that Socrates begins his lifelong task of practicing philosophy. 470 to 399 BC, Plato, a young aristocratic Athenian, is intending to pursue some kind of career in drama or literature. And the story goes that the day that Plato encountered Socrates and engaged him in the kind of conversation that the texts for today, philosophical conversations, exemplify, that very day, Plato went back home, burned all of his tragedies in progress, and decided to devote his own life to philosophy, roughly around 407 BC. So who is this figure that could have such a dramatic, instant effect on the young Plato and on many others? So usually when we're meeting in person or as a group over Zoom, I really like to try to introduce Socrates with a question. That seems like the most appropriate way to introduce him. He spent his life questioning seemingly everything and everyone. So my question, just kind of try to capture where I'm coming from, would be for you. Who is the wisest person you know, and what is it that makes him or her wise? Now, obviously, we're not doing a live discussion right now, but I can say, and hopefully you will or are mulling this question over a little bit, that in previous semesters, answers that I can remember include family members, even teachers, sometimes a famous figure. One student once told me their grandmother is the wisest person they know. The things that they know about life come from their grandmother. Maybe an older sibling, an older cousin, who just seems to know what life is about. And that student would kind of just absorb those life lessons from them. Like one time I had a student answer Elon Musk, okay? If he's definitely successful at what he does, sure, maybe you can make a case that he's also wise. But I think where Socrates comes in is that he spent his life. I'm going to pause for one moment. So Socrates spends his life trying to find someone who's wise. If he encounters someone who makes a claim to wisdom, he'll immediately ask things like, where does your wisdom come from? What are the contents of your wisdom? A very particular experience that set this quest in motion is recounted in another Platonic dialogue. It's not among the readings for today, but I can kind of paraphrase some of it in brief. Socrates says in the Apology that years before he was an old man, a friend of his went to what was known as the Oracle at Delphi. This is during a time when religion involved consultations with oracles who could claim to give prophecies based on their connection to the gods, things like that. And this friend of Socrates asks the oracle, who is the wisest person? To that person's surprise, and even more so to the surprise of Socrates, the oracle's answer is Socrates is the wisest human being. Socrates can't believe it. As a young person, he thinks he doesn't know anything. How can he be the wisest human being alive? So his explanation for the rest of his philosophical enterprise, for the rest of his life, is to find someone wiser than him. So he's a little bit sly when he says this, but that's one way that he frames his activity, his practice of philosophy, to find someone wiser than him, to find someone who is wise. And in the dialogues by Plato, you'll find that he, and keeping in mind that these are kind of recreations or artistic depictions of the kind of conversations that Socrates had in real life, he ends up having conversations with all kinds of different people. Yes, there are young aristocratic people like Plato himself. There are also merchants. One dialogue famously features someone who's actually a slave. Socrates has a conversation with him. There are also people who are professional practitioners of wisdom, a peculiar group known as sophists, who in the time of Socrates and Plato would travel from city to city, offering to tutor young people, and for a price, give them their wisdom, give them their knowledge. So when Socrates would encounter such individuals, not just merchants, but also professional professors of wisdom, what he would basically do is very politely tear their arguments to pieces. And of course, you can imagine in the process of him doing this, not just to ordinary people, but also to politicians, people with power, he ended up angering a lot of his fellow citizens. So eventually, after a lifetime of doing this, Socrates is charged with crimes that don't really even exist today. These are impiety and corrupting the young, and is put on trial. So another famous dialogue of Plato's, which again is not on our syllabus, but it's called the Apology. This is in which Socrates defends his life and his conduct, and gave rise to this very famous quote, which is on the slide now. Probably neither of us knows anything noble and good, but he supposes he knows something when he does not know, while I, just as I do not know, Do not even suppose that I know. I am likely to be a little wiser than he is in this very thing, that whatever I do not know, I do not even suppose I know. So this is Socrates explaining his method, which is called dialectic, which we'll say a little bit more about in a moment, in which he, again, very often very politely, with all civility and respect, encounters another Greek and tries to engage them in conversation. How can we uncover the truth together? And oftentimes when his discussion partner is someone who is claiming to know some kind of truth, it turns out that their arguments do not stand, that when subjected to rigorous scrutiny, the arguments fall apart. And so given that Socrates spent a lifetime doing this, it's really one of the key things that distinguishes him from other philosophers before and after. And we don't have anyone on the syllabus who came before Socrates, but there are plenty of examples of the kind of thing I'm talking about from after Socrates, when a philosopher comes forward and claims to know the truth, claims to be a champion of the truth. One of the things that makes Socrates so radical is that he made no such claim. He did not claim to know the truth. Whatever I do not know, I do not even suppose I know. That's a quote that's sometimes paraphrased as, all I know is I know nothing. Socrates is claiming that that is his wisdom. All of these other people claim to be wise, but their arguments do not withstand my scrutiny. I don't know anything they don't know, other than I acknowledge that I do not know anything. That would be what makes the oracle at Delphi say Socrates is the wisest person there is. So it's a very, he represents a whole different approach to philosophy compared to his predecessors and to others after him. He is not making any special claim to the truth, but in the process of pursuing the truth, he exemplifies what philosophy is. A corollary, also sort of a related, very famous statement from the same dialogue, it's not on the screen, is the unexamined life is not worth living, or the unexamined life is not worthy of being lived. That seems to be a claim Socrates will make, that he's not willing to do what seemingly everyone else does, go about their lives as though they have wisdom, when it turns out their wisdom is non-existent. Just because he knows that he knows nothing does not mean he's satisfied with it. He insists on practicing philosophy literally to his last day. The first text from which there's an excerpt, that's the assigned reading for today, called the Phaedo, named after another dialogue participant that Plato has Socrates interact with, takes place on the day of Socrates' death. Socrates' self-defense in the dialogue called Apology was not persuasive. He was found guilty of the crimes he was accused of and given the extremely severe penalty of death. There's a lot that could be said about that. But in this context, I'll just emphasize that the dialogue from which we have an excerpt for today's reading yet again exemplifies Socrates' devotion to philosophy. We see in that dialogue that on his very last day, he decided to spend it by doing philosophy. So starting to get a bit more specific about Socrates' approach to philosophizing. Maybe you've come across the phrase before, Socratic method. Basically it means question and answer, as opposed to giving a lecture and asking people to agree with you. I think to be more specific than just using the phrase Socratic method, the term often applied to Socrates and that pops up throughout the Platonic dialogues is dialectic. It's a very unique approach to try to uncover the truth. Whatever the specific subject may be that Socrates and the other people he's having a conversation with want to know the truth about. So the readings for today, they touch on ontology, what is the fundamental nature of reality, and the myth of the cave, which we'll get to, could be construed as an allegory for education or how you attain personal liberation. The way Socrates always talks about these things and that Plato depicts the conversations is through dialectic. So I'm not going to read both of these quotes. I'll just read the second one. And this is one definition of dialectic. It is making presuppositions not sources, but genuine standing places, like stepping stones and springboards, in order that, by going up to what is presuppositionless, at the source of everything, rational speech may descend that way to a conclusion. So presupposition we could think of as a temporary assumption. So an example of how this passage may play out in practice would be if Socrates and other people he's having a conversation with want to answer a given question. We're going to see next class that a key guiding question for Plato's most famous dialogue, the Republic, is it better to live a just or unjust life? Or does living a just life profit more than living an unjust life? So already those kind of phrases contain lots of words that would require spelling out, to say the least. To get a conversation going, I think the way you apply the second quote here to the question for the Republic, you have to start to make an assumption, a tentative assumption, make a presupposition, and then with the people engaged in dialectic, you kind of work out and revise that and pare down, replace, come up with a new presupposition, and then the idea is you make progress that way, and little by little, each presupposition you have can act like a springboard or a stepping stone to further progress toward answering that question. Is it better to live an unjust or just life? Well, one thing we'll see next class that a lot of the Republic is devoted to is defining what justice is. Socrates and the people he's talking with have to come up with some kind of presupposition, some stepping stone to get a provisional definition of what justice may be. Because the siren's blaring, I'm going to pause one more moment again. So Socrates will use dialectic to try to arrive at the truth. And along the way, it is also his tool for uncovering that just about everyone else he interacts with, even if they think they are wise, they are not wise. But a noteworthy aspect of that enterprise to me is Socrates is not doing dialectic in order to prove how smart he is or to vanquish his opponent. Oftentimes, the result of Socratic dialectic is for the person who's speaking with Socrates, after being subjected to very rigorous questioning, finds themselves in a state of perplexity, in a state of wonder, is just at a total loss. I thought I knew what justice was. I thought I knew what virtue was, but it turns out I do not. I'm stunned. And that, one way of interpreting the Platonic dialogues, these recreations of Socratic conversations, is the beginning of philosophy. Is when we admit that we don't know the things we think we know, that we can start to truly think about them. So we're gradually getting to today's readings, but just a few more general remarks about Plato, kind of for your own knowledge, are themes that recur throughout the 24 or so Platonic dialogues. that number 24 is not hard and fast because there's some dialogues, these being very ancient texts, about which there's some dispute. Did Plato really write this? Was it someone else pretending to be Plato? But it's roughly 24 dialogues that, as mentioned, cover many, many different subjects within philosophy. One recurring theme is immortality and recollection. One thing that can be off-putting or difficult to kind of compute when reading Plato for the first time is discussion of the soul. That word comes up throughout the texts that are excerpted for our class. It's not often nowadays that you hear people talking about the soul, at least not in the same way that it seems to be taken for granted to exist in the Platonic dialogues. A sort of convenient way to think of the soul would be that it's something like our word mind. It's the seat of mental activity. Is it also the seat of spiritual activity? What might that be? Well, that would take a very long digression. But Plato, through Socrates, will constantly be treating this idea that our souls did not come into being in the form that we experience them now. They had a very long past life in other bodies. And it's from time to time that we in our current form can recollect, remember beautiful things that our souls previously experienced. Okay, it might sound strange. It's very short, hard to do justice to it in just a few sentences. One takeaway is the application to education. The idea that nothing can be taught to the soul that has to do its work on its own. And that's described in the form of this idea of recollection. That the soul previously used to know the deepest truths, but has just forgotten them, and that the work of philosophy is to recollect them. Okay, maybe that's just a strange allegory, but I think, again, it emphasizes that education, it complements the Socratic idea of pursuing the truth. No one can tell you what the truth is. It's something you, your soul, has to do on its own. Another major theme that'll come up especially in next classes, what is the ideal state? Plato was very much a person of his times, which, to kind of continue the very rudimentary kind of history lesson from the second slide, after Athens and other Greek city-states repel Persian invasion, they themselves descend into something like civil war with each other. The time of crisis that Plato lives through. He ends up asking fundamental questions about how human beings should govern themselves, and in the process, very much transcends the conditions of his own time to raise and provide possible permanent answers to the questions of political philosophy. I'll have more to say about that next class. The nature of philosophy itself is also a recurring concern in the Platonic dialogues. Socrates is presented as the major example of what a philosopher is. Philosophy is not only radically questioning, but also a way of life. Socrates, when he became a philosopher, I mean, there's different biographies about who he was and what he did. One biography maintains that he was a stonecutter before he became a philosopher. He also was definitely a soldier during that kind of period of civil war I mentioned in passing. But above all, he exemplifies the philosopher, and part of his project is exploring what philosophy is. I'll just quickly read the quote that's kind of in larger font. This is from yet another Platonic dialogue called The Sophist. To some people, philosophers seem to be in no way honorable and to others in every way worthy. And sometimes they make their appearance as statesmen and sometimes as sophists. And sometimes they give the sense of being in a totally mad condition. So a lot of different possibilities of what a philosopher is. Even now, we could pause and scrutinize this text a little bit. What would it mean for a philosopher to be honorable or dishonorable? Is there a bad way of doing philosophy? That would seem to suggest that there is. Is it bad to take money for doing philosophy, for example? Also, what about this idea that philosophers can make their appearance as statesmen, as politicians? I mean, have you ever encountered a politician who was a philosopher? Is there a philosophy of politics? And then the last part of this quote, sometimes they look like they're in a totally mad condition. Is philosophy a form of madness? Maybe it's a good segue to this other major theme in the Platonic dialogues, eros. The excerpts for this class don't really touch on this major theme, but erotic desire is a recurring topic in the Platonic dialogues. And I think we'll start to, one thing we maybe get a little bit of a sense of from the excerpt from the Phaedo is that when Plato is writing about, when Socrates is talking about the erotic, it's not just a desire for pleasure, although neither one of them necessarily look down on pleasure in the way that other more austere, stern philosophers tend to do. But it can also be eros, the Greek word, which is often translated as desire. It can also mean a desire for the eternal, the form of the beautiful, the form of justice, the highest form of justice. So the question is philosophy the way to achieve those things? I mean, if you talk to someone now and say that philosophy is an erotic undertaking, I mean, I'll speak for myself. If I say that to my social milieu, they'll laugh at me. But Plato makes a serious case that there's a philosophical meaning, a philosophical depth to eros, to desire. And we've already talked a little bit about the dialogue form that the Platonic dialogues take. I think one thing I'll note is, since these are literary works, they're not just kind of dry essays trying to persuade a reader. I think the best way to approach them is like looking for things that we would in other genres of literature. So Plato can be, it'll be easier to pick up other authors on our syllabus than it is with Plato. Plato takes some time to learn how to read, but once you kind of get into a groove, if you ever find yourself reading Plato again, which I definitely hope you do, my suggestion would be that yes, you treat it not too differently than you would a novel or a play. The setting matters. The characters matter. Who's talking to who? Socrates tends to talk in different ways to different people. I would never call Socrates a liar, but sometimes he interacts with one person very differently than he would with another. What does that say about the discussion that's underway? And then also literary touches in terms of the way the dialogues are shaped. So all that's to say that part of the fun of Plato, believe it or not, Plato can be fun, is appreciating it just as much, appreciating his dialogues just as much as literary works as they are works of philosophy. Another statement I'll make about dialogue form is that I think it really emphasizes that there's no firm dogma in Plato. This is something I want to drive home. Going back to the kind of three takeaways for today, the example of Socrates. I think the example of Socrates is reinforced by Plato's very writing style. Socrates says a lot of things. It's something people coming to Plato for the first time can have a hard time with. On the one hand, he said, as we just saw, all that he knows is that he knows nothing. On the other hand, he just talks a lot. It often seems like he's making an affirmative statement of one kind or another about the truth. In the Republic, he goes into great detail about what the best form of city-state, what the best form of government would be. It sure seems like he's giving us a thesis and wants us to accept it. I would say that that goes against the kind of spirit of Socrates and the spirit of the Platonic dialogues. These are works that are not designed, again, to persuade us of things. They're to get us to think about them on our own. Therefore, you can't really reduce something that Socrates said and Plato wrote to a specific theory or to a dogma, because Socrates and Plato are always leaving room for debate. And I think we'll see that in the specific example with the so-called theory of the forms, which is our next slide. So let me start with this term ontology. It's not something that Plato used to describe his own work, to the best of my knowledge. It's a label that's kind of been applied to one of his most famous ideas. Ontology being the philosophical study of what really exists. Specifically, if you look at this word, it has a Greek derivation, as many other terms in philosophy. Probably the second half, the suffix you see all the time, the ology part means simply study of. The first part, onto, denotes the Greek term for being. So the term means philosophical study of being, the philosophical study of what really exists. Maybe a glib way of phrasing it is ontology is the part of philosophy that asks what the meaning of the verb to be is. What is it? What does the word is mean? And those are phrases that, it's actually not a terrible start to ontology or to philosophy in general. Using the phrase to be, conjugations of it, we use them all the time without thinking twice about it. But maybe compare it to the negation of to be, not to be. Maybe try to put it in some specific examples. Look at the past tense, look at the future tense, look at the present tense. Look at things in the imagination. You can start to see how this seemingly simple word being could be much more rich and much more complicated. So a philosophical approach to being asks, what does that verb really mean? And what does it mean really to exist? Are there higher and lower forms of existence? If there are higher forms, are they accessible to us? And this is where the so-called theory of the form comes in. Okay, so keeping in mind that kind of caveat I just tried to give, that Plato is not giving us dogmas. He's not trying to beat us over the head with an argument and force us into accepting it. It's good to know, it's good to keep in mind that the sort of text for our first reading for today is an example of what's often called his theory of the forms. So I've pulled up a text to help us try to start understanding what these forms are. So like I said, the excerpt for the first reading for today comes from the dialogue called the Phaedo. It's named after, like many of the other dialogues, one of the individuals that Socrates has a conversation with. And this conversation is actually special because it happens on the day that Socrates dies, the day that his death sentence imposed by people of Athens after his trial for impiety and corrupting the youth has been imposed. And by this point in the dialogue, kind of talks about the forms throughout it. But to sort of set the stage here, at the very beginning of the reading where it said start, Socrates is describing his experiences, looking back on his life when he first set out to try to understand the truth. He says he basically looked to science, to biology, to understand the cause of everything that exists, and found it to be inadequate. So he began what he terms a second sailing, a second effort. And that effort centers on the forms. He terms on page 80, where he exemplifies by the beautiful itself by itself, a good and a big and all the others. So when Plato is writing about the forms, when Socrates is talking about them, the clue we get here is the greatest, the thing itself by itself, things like beauty and justice. Can leave it at that for now. But what are these things supposed to be? We get a bit more of an explanation here. It says, when other people want to talk about justice or beauty, he's not going to listen to any hypothesis other than nothing makes a thing beautiful but the presence of our communion with that beautiful, capital B, the form of beautiful, or however and in whatever way you say it happens. I don't make any definite assertion, a very quintessentially Socratic thing to say. He said, I'm not 100% about this as being set in stone, but I do assert that it's by the beautiful that all beautiful things are beautiful. And that's really the key sentence. It's by the beautiful that all beautiful things are beautiful. So he's arguing that, or maybe I'm reluctant to give a definition of what a form is, but based on this, what you could say is that a form is something by virtue of communing with which a thing in our average everyday experience has the attribute of that form. To take some specific examples that might illustrate this. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you're going to see all kinds of paintings, sculptures, art forms from seemingly every conceivable time and place in world history. There'll be rooms with Renaissance art from Italy in the 1500s. There'll be a room with South Asian art from 500 AD. As you walk from room to room, you might say, hey, I like that. I don't like that. This is really beautiful. That's also beautiful. All these different things that you could apply the word beautiful to. I think where the theory of the forms would come in is that it explains what it is we think we mean when we call a Renaissance painting from 1500 beautiful, and use that same word beautiful to describe a South Asian sculpture from 600 AD, that there's some higher form of beautiful. There's a beautiful itself by itself that endows these examples with their beauty. And even if we don't encounter the beautiful itself by itself, it's this hypothetical construct, this form of beauty. It's what Socrates is positing. He says it's a hypothesis that explains our day-to-day experience of beauty. And he's admittedly not sure what the exact connection would be from something like seeing different works of art in the Met Museum and calling them beautiful, and the way they quote unquote partake of the beautiful itself by itself, the form of the beautiful. His phrasing is, nothing makes a thing beautiful but the presence or communion with that beautiful, or however and in whatever way you say it happens. So he doesn't make the connection clear between the beautiful itself by itself and a day-to-day, more humble experience of beauty. But again, that's his hypothesis. That's the only thing he thinks can explain how something could ever be beautiful or good, that there's a perfect, somehow perfect form of those things, of the beautiful, of the good. To take another example, when the word justice gets thrown around, context I often hear it in, that you hear it in the news, is something like the criminal justice system. Police make an arrest, trial happens, jury votes, judge delivers sentence. I think to apply the theory of forms to this, there's a form of the just itself by itself, the highest perfected essence of what justice is. And what happens in court is not that. You could only call it just to the extent that it has communion with the form, or however, in whatever way you say it happens. And it will presumably be unjust, a court proceeding, to the extent that it does not have communion with the form of justice itself. In the text for today, Socrates gives some other examples, which I think are, the way I interpret them, is they're designed to provoke us into thinking more elaborately about the theory of the forms. Because the first examples he gives are about the beautiful itself and the good itself. He also throws in the big itself. But he starts talking more about bigness itself, the implication that there's a smaller itself. This is where I kind of get tripped up, because when I find it more acceptable to imagine the forms when it's something self-contained, like beautiful or good itself. But big and small, in similar terms, are comparisons. How could there be a form of bigness itself when something is, I think of in everyday experience, something is big only in comparison to something else? I'm bigger than my nephew. LeBron James is bigger than me. These are relative terms. How can there be a form of bigness itself? That seems not to make sense. So I think right away Socrates is poking his audience to get them to really think and not be too quick to accept the theory that there is a form of these good things. There's also another question that comes up right away. Is there a form of everything? Okay, it's one thing to say there's a form of beautiful, there's a form of good, maybe there's a form of big, although that's hard to grasp. Are there forms, are there perfected essences, so to speak, more mundane things? Is there the form of a house? Okay, maybe you could think of the form of the house as an architect's designs for a house, but is there a highest, most perfect form of the architectural version of a house? And other things are only houses to the extent that they, to Socrates' word again, have communion with the form of the house. This is actually where, bring it back to the slide, I included a comic that sort of makes fun of this theory. You have Plato on stage giving his theory of the forms. An audience member says, no, this is stupid, and asks in the second panel, what about this cup, Plato? Is there an eternal perfect cup somewhere? And then Plato replies, yes, in a sense, there is a form of cupness, To which the audience member, I think it's supposed to be Diogenes the Cynic, replies, "What about the emptiness inside the cup? Is there a form of emptiness?" And then the put down is, you'll in the last panel, you'll find, Plato, that the emptiness is in here, pointing to Plato's head. So it's something you can poke fun at, but it also can be a really powerful theory. And I think there's a reason why Socrates, on the last day of his life, around age 70, is still saying, this is the best explanation I've come up with to explain the things in existence, the ontology of reality, what really exists. Again, on a day-to-day level, we might have passing experiences of beauty or of justice at a museum or at court or reading the news. But the only thing that gives coherence to these experiences is positing as a hypothesis that there's an utmost form of beauty or of justice. And then the task of philosophy is somehow try to uncover what that essence might be. Is it even reachable? If you posit that there's a beautiful itself, how would you access it? I think that's a good transition to the myth of the cave. So the myth of the cave comes from the Republic, as I think I already mentioned, and it's more than halfway into the text, which is a very long one. And at this point in the discussion, Socrates and his conversation partners are talking about education. And this leads Socrates to give us really one of the most famous, most well-known and celebrated images in history of philosophy texts. It's actually a drier way of describing it than I wanted to. I find it to be a very powerful and even moving kind of image or allegory. So to dive in, Socrates has us imagine a cave underground, at the bottom of which are prisoners in darkness. And then he describes their ascent outward, what it's like when they get there and what they find there. So I'm not going to do an entire detailed recapitulation of the image. I hope you've gotten a chance to read it yourselves by now. But it starts with Socrates describing an image of our nature, likening it to a condition such as the following: human beings in a cave-like dwelling underground, having a long pathway open to the light all across the cave. They're in it from childhood onwards, with their legs and necks in restraints, so that they're held in place and look only to the front. For them, the light is from a fire burning up above and a long way behind them. And between the fire and the prisoners, there's an upper road. Picture a little wall built along this road, like the low partitions puppeteers use to screen the humans who display the puppets above them. So Plato's Republic is not an illustrated text, but here's a very vivid image that Socrates is inviting us to think of. On that wall that's still in the cave, going all along it, there are humans carrying all sorts of articles that jut out over it. Figurines of men and other animals fashioned out of stone and wood and materials of all kinds, with sound effects. And the shadows of those puppets kind of picture people at the bottom of a cave, a wall, puppets going back and forth with sound effects. Behind the wall somewhere is a fire that's casting shadows against the bottom of a cave, which we are constrained to look at, and it alone, with neck restraints. And all that we see are the shadows that are cast by the puppets at the bottom of this cave. And the person Socrates is speaking with, named Glaucon, interjects, You're describing a bizarre image and bizarre prisoners. Like us, Socrates' reply. These people spend their lives. It's the only thing they've ever seen are these strange shadows cast by the fire and the puppets. If they hear an echo, that's what distracts them. And Socrates says, in every way, such people wouldn't consider anything to be the truth other than the shadows of artificial things. If you spent your whole life in this cave and all you've ever known are the shadows cast by the puppets and the weird sound effects, that's what your reality is. Then consider, Socrates says, what their release would be like and their recovery from their restraints and their delusion if things like that were to happen to them by nature, if that's what really unfolded. Whenever one of them would be released and suddenly required to stand up and turn his neck around and walk and look upward toward the light, he'd suffer from pain from doing all these things. And because of the blazes of light, he wouldn't have the power to get a clear sight of the things whose shadows he'd seen before. What do you imagine he'd say if someone were to tell him that he'd been seeing rubbish then, but now, somewhat nearer to what is and turned toward the things that have more being, he was seeing more accurately? And especially if, pointing to each of the things passing by, would force him to answer as he asked what they are, don't you imagine he'd be at a loss and believe the things he'd seen before were truer than the ones pointed out to him now? And if forced to look at the light itself, wouldn't he have pain in his eyes and escape by turning back toward those things he was able to make out and consider them clearer in their very being than the ones pointed out to him? And if one were to be dragged away from there by force along the rough, steep road up and didn't let go until he dragged him out into the light of the sun, wouldn't he be feeling pain and anger from being dragged? And when he came into the light and had his eyes filled with its dazzle, wouldn't he be unable to see even one of the things now said to be the true ones? He'd need to get accustomed to it. At first, he'd most easily make out the shadows, and after that, the images of human beings and other things in water, and only later, the things themselves. And turning from those things, he'd gaze on the things in the heavens, and at the heavens themselves, more easily by night, looking at the starlight and moonlight than by day, at the sun and its light. Last, I'd imagine he'd gain sight of the sun, not its appearances in water or in any setting foreign to it, but he'd have the power to see it by itself, to see it itself by itself in its own realm, and contemplate it the way it is. So keeping in mind that Socrates says that this is an image of our nature as it involves education and the lack of it, my question for all of you is, and this will be an essay prompt in a few weeks, what is the meaning of this image? Sort of roughly recap, human beings are said to spend their whole lives at the bottom of a cave, shackled in place, forced to look at the wall at the bottom of the cave. Their whole life, the only thing they can see are shadows cast by fire and puppets. And then in some detail, Socrates describes what it's like if they're released and turned around, even if it's by force, and eventually step outside, where they're effectively blinded and takes a long time for their eyes to get used to seeing the real world. So what is this an image of? Immediately, Socrates is saying this involves education, but what does that mean? Does it mean going to math class? Learning how to do calculus is like being shrouded in ignorance, and then you go out and all of reality and the sun and all of its glory is illuminated to you? Maybe. One application would be the context of the other reading for today, the reading that touches on the forms. At the very bottom of the cave are the shadows represent day-to-day reality, the reality from when you and I woke up this morning, had breakfast, got on the bus, whatever. These are shadows of reality, is one interpretation. The real world outside, and with the forms above. I mean, the vocabulary here does somewhat echo the forms. Seeing the sun itself. is completely closed off to us. So that raises the question, how do you access, if you want to, the world outside the cave? The term Socrates uses that there's a kind of turning around, released from shackles, being turned around, and being forced out. What could that possibly represent? There's all kinds of applications for this image or allegory. There's a political application. We're all at the bottom of a cave. Our leaders or our rulers keep us deceived or distracted with shadows and puppets. And what's really going on in the real world is somewhere above and outside of us. This image also always reminds me of the experience of watching TV. Your back is to the real world, you're in the dark, your neck is constrained, you're looking just at a screen with artificial images. But what does that distract you from? How do you get away from that? And what would you find if you are trying to uncover the truth? So these are the kind of questions I think if you wanted to pick the, I'm going to give you 3 essay prompts, one of them about the cave. If you pick the cave essay prompt, you could write quite a good deal answering those kinds of questions. So I think, again, in the spirit of Socrates, I want to wind down by sharing some questions. You don't have to write about these or anything for now. Like I said, I will give you essay prompts. But here is some food for thought. Can the forms adequately explain our experience of things like good and beautiful? How do they fall short? 2, this will be an essay prompt. Describe some examples to which the myth of the cave could be applied. How would you know you had escaped the cave? And 3, does dialectic strike you as a good approach for finding out the truth? Why or why not? So with that said, we will conclude our discussion of Plato in our next class. Thank you so much.